Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Rob. You're watching the House Call. Thanks again for joining me. I'm so privileged to be able to hang out with you and talk about the greatest sport of all time. I'm talking about pro wrestling. I've got some nice Georgia. We like to drink muscadine wine here. I like white wines and I like sweet wines. I like Moscato and I like this muscadine wine. And this comes from the Georgia winery right up the road. So I'll be having this tonight as we hang out and talk, continue our stroll down memory lane. Mm, I love that. Hints of honey with sweet Georgia muscadines. You cannot beat it. This week, our strolls down memory lane have taken us to 1986, where we are reviewing my assertion that 1986 was the greatest year in pro wrestling history. Of course, this is my opinion and mine alone. You may disagree, and that's fine. But I, uh, uh, I, uh, I just cannot help. For me, like every year, even years before this are a footnote. Like every year, it's like 1986 sits at the center. Every year before was leading up to it, and every year since has been looking back to it. Now, 1986 was a great year anyway, regardless of wrestling. It was the year of perestroika, signaling the beginning of the end of the Cold War. Piper would like to know that Phantom of the Opera debuted as a stage musical in October of 1986 in London's West End. You had some of the greatest films: Top Gun, Platoon, Alien, that debuted at the box office. We Are the World won the Grammy for Record of the Year. My mother's favorite all-time movie, Out of Africa, won the Oscar for Best Picture. But in 1986, I don't care what area of culture you're talking about, musicals, sports, whatever, wrestling reigns supreme for at least 10 reasons, Now, let's quickly review real quick reasons 10 through 6 for those who missed the last episode. I said number 10 was the Sam Muchnick tournament in St. Louis, Missouri, which was won by Harley Race. Number 9 was the infamous altercation between Jim Cornette and Baby Doll. Number 8 was WrestleMania 2, headlined by Hulk Hogan and King Kong Bundy, at least in the LA rendition of that. You had two other main events, Piper versus Mr. T in a boxing match in New York, and the Dream Team against the British Bulldogs in Chicago. And then number 7 was a world-class Wrestling Association's third annual Cotton Extravaganza, headlined by Bruiser Brody and Abdul the Butcher in a steel cage. And of course, number 6 was the inaugural Jim Crockett Senior Memorial Cup. If you just went with those reasons, that would be enough. But there's more, much, much more. And on now to the top 5 reasons why 1986 was the greatest year in wrestling history. Number 5, the Rock and Roll Express versus Midnight Express feud. We knew this was going to happen. The similarities between the two, not just the name, but the style, the fact that they were quickly rising in their own areas, as being two of the great tag teams ever. The Rock and Roll Express, of course, had defeated the Russians for the tag team championships, and this collision course seemed inevitable. And inspired by the success of WWF Saturday Night's Main Event, the NWA tried an experiment of its own. A supercard comprised of dream matches that were selected by the fans. It was called Superstars of the Superstation. It was filmed in the historic Omni, and this would be the template for future endeavors, most notably Clash of the Champions. And this card was stacked. You had the Road Warriors and the Russians, always a major event. Dusty versus Tully, those had a tremendous feud. Flair versus Ronnie Garvin, again, one of the great feuds of the 80s. But the most important event that happened that night was when Jim Cornette's Midnight Express, Beautiful Bobby, and Loverboy Dennis, one of the most storied tag teams in sports history, dethroned Ricky and Robert to win the NWA World's Tag Team Championship. Now, what's shocking about this is that when I go back and think of Beautiful Bobby and Loverboy Dennis, I'm like, this is one of the greatest tag teams ever. Now, maybe Beautiful Bobby and Sweet Stan might have been the greatest version of this team, but Loverboy Dennis and Beautiful Bobby were pretty good. And it just seemed to me like they were always champion. I'm shocked to when I think back, and they only held the world title one time, and that occurred this year when February 2nd 1956, no, too much Moscato there, February 2nd 1986, where they dethroned the Rock and Roll Express. I remember watching this on Saturday with my mom. My mom, of course, she was asleep on the couch, but I was watching. We didn't have a lot of resources or monies. We had TBS. we had baseball, we had wrestling, and I had some old Transformer action figures that I inherited, and I had ascribed personalities to them and had turned them into, the Decepticons were the Midnight Express and the Autobots were the Rock and Roll Express. And I remember, playing this match as this match was going on before me, just sure that the Rock and Roll Express would win. And when the Midnight Express won the title in this legendary match, I literally cried. I explained to my mom, "You don't understand, the Rock and Roll Express, they've held the belt for so long now." And, I was brokenhearted, but this match this for me is one of the great tag team matches. I guess it has an emotional connection to me, but this match set up the perennial feud. I mean, Jim Cornette was given the Rock and Roll Express hell for years. And it started really, as far as Crockett Promotions goes, it started on this night, February 2nd, 1986. The number 5 reason why 1986 was the greatest year in wrestling history. Number 4, Starrcade 86. There have been many great Starrcades. Starrcade 83 may be the greatest of them all. But this one was unique. It was unique not only in the fact that it was just a stacked card, because all the Starrcades were stacked. I mean, this one you had Tully versus Dusty. Again, anytime you had Tully and Dusty link up, it was a major event. You had the Rock and Roll Express versus the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, Ole and Arn Anderson. Ric Flair and Nikita Koloff wrestled in a legendary match. This is an infamous match because of something that happened to Nikita, which we won't go into here, but that was a great match. But of course, you had the Paul Jones army. Paul Jones's army and Jimmy Valiant were at the peak of their feud, and in this match, Jimmy Valiant wrestled Paul Jones in a hair versus hair match, and Paul Jones, of course, lost that match and had his head shaved. You had Wahoo McDaniel against Rick Rude in an Indian strap match. This card was stacked, but the match that defined this, the match that gave this event its name, was the scaffold match. The Night of the Skywalkers, the Midnight Express versus the Road Warriors. Now, a lot of people think that this was the first scaffold match, and it wasn't. It wasn't even the first scaffold match in the NWA. You had scaffold matches going back as early as 1971, where Jerry Jarrett faced Don Green. You had a Mid-South a Mid-South Championship Wrestling scaffold match, the Rock and Roll Express versus the Midnight Express. This was not the first scaffold match by any measure, but it was certainly the greatest, and it remains the greatest. And there have been scaffold matches since, but this one was the one that took the cake. And of course, we all remember the scene at the end where Jim Cornette's being chased up the scaffold, and there he is in the middle, notoriously afraid of heights, and he'll tell you that, like, for real, he's afraid of heights. And there he is in the middle of the ring with a Road Warrior on either side. He finally, seeking his escape, he grabs onto one of the brackets underneath the underside of the scaffold, and he hangs there, and he hangs there, and he hangs there until he falls and busts out both of his knees, for real, like he legit injured himself. And that card was one of the most epic cards of all time, and it is the number 4 reason why 1986 was the greatest year in pro wrestling history. Number 3, oh my gosh, we're getting into some high territory now, guys. For me, you got to remember, this is at the height of the Cold War. Now, true, I just said perestroika was happening, but we were still afraid. I mean, we grew up afraid that the Russians were going to bomb us, or we were going to bomb the Russians or something. And we were just going to, I remember, I think Superman 4 came out that year. And the whole premise behind that was the arms race. It might've come out a year before or after that. It was right around that time frame. But the stigma of the Cold War permeated this era of the 1980s, this period of the 1980s, the mid 80s. And it always played out in wrestling. I mean, you had in the WWF, you had Nikolai Volkov and the Iron Sheik forming a tandem, representing the Eastern Bloc and the Warsaw Pact. And of course, in the NWA, you had the Russians, Ivan Koloff, Nikita Koloff, Don Kernodle at one point, and Crusher Khrushchev. And anyway, Nikita Koloff emerged as a challenger to Magnum TA's United States title. Magnum TA had won the championship from Wahoo McDaniel. and he had a very gruesome "I Quit" match against Tully Blanchard, in which Tully Blanchard never uttered the words "I quit," by the way. But Magnum TA's trajectory was very, very high, and he was considered the future heir to Ric Flair. But at this point, he held the U.S. Championship, which was considered the stepping stone, the number one contender to the title. And Nikita Koloff emerged as a threat to Flair's title, but he had to go through Magnum first. And I remember a contract signing, and NWA president Bob Geigel was there. And in this contract signing, Nikita Koloff insults Magnum TA's mother. Magnum TA's mother was there at the contract signing. Nikita goes on and on about why he needs his mama there. Is he a mama's boy that in Russia a woman knows her place and men do things on their own? It was very misogynistic, but it riled Magnum TA up. Magnum TA jumps across the table. He pummels Nikita Koloff, and they have this big feud. Of course, Ivan comes in and helps out, and they get the better of Magnum that day. Bob Geigel doesn't vacate. He holds up the U.S. title. So Magnum TA hasn't lost the title, but the title is to be determined in a best of 7 series for this championship. It wasn't the first best of series. It wasn't the last. But again, just like the scaffold match, this one set the tone. And for me, the 7 levels of hate series is like that. They all harken back to this legendary series. And Nikita Koloff goes up 3 wins to nothing. He is 1 win away from winning it all. Just like the Braves were 1 win away from going to the World Series this year. Nikita Koloff wins those 3 first matches, and then he chokes, setting up a decisive match 7, August the 17th, 1986. This is right at the conclusion of the Great American Bash, which we'll talk about here shortly. And Nikita Koloff defeats Magnum TA for the championship. Now, Nikita Koloff, by the way, one of the most scary, intimidating athletes in the world, would go on to become one of the most beloved athletes. His wife, Mandy Koloff, of course, died tragically, and that served as the impetus for him to make a turn of perspective and philosophy, and he becomes one of the great heroes in later years. But in 1986, that was not the case. He was the scourge of the United States. He was indeed the Russian nightmare. And on August the 17th, 1986, the unthinkable happened. Nikita Koloff became the United States heavyweight champion, defeating Magnum TA in the final 7th match, the decisive 7th match in a best of 7 series, the series. One of the great events of all time, could easily be number 1 on this list if it were not for 2 others, okay? And that brings us to number 2, the Great American Bash Tour. This was not just going to be a supercard like Starrcade or WrestleMania or the Bunkhouse Stampede or the Crockett Cup or what have you. This was going to be an entire tour, and it would go on for a month, and Ric Flair would defend this title every single night of the tour. The cities on this tour were Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Memphis, Charlotte, Cincinnati, Roanoke, Jacksonville, Richmond, Fayetteville, Johnson City, Norfolk, Greensboro, and Atlanta. And the challengers to Ric Flair's title included Ricky Morton, Road Warrior Hawk, Road Warrior Animal, Ronnie Garvin, Nikita Koloff, Robert Gibson, Magnum TA, Wahoo McDaniel, and of course, Dusty Rhodes. You also had the feud between the Road Warriors and the Midnight Express, Baby Doll and Jim Cornette playing out. You had Nikita Koloff and Magnum TA had several of their best of 7 matches playing out during this particular tournament. And of course, all the stars of the NWA and Crockett promotions were featured in this, maybe the greatest wrestling tour of all time, the greatest defense of the NWA title. Like, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 times in less than 30 days. Flair would defend it successfully 12 times. Or excuse me, I guess 11 times. He would lose it on the 12th. We'll get to that in a minute. I don't think a feat like that has been accomplished. And I may be overspeaking here and may just be being a little bit melodramatic and nostalgic, but you'd have to go all the way back to the Aldous Crusade, or up to the Aldous Crusade, to find a greater tour of the NWA title in such a short span of time under such high stakes. The National Wrestling Alliance's Great American Bash. So the number 2 reason why 1986 was the greatest year of all time was the NWA's Great American Bash Summer Tour. Now, before we get to number 1, I do want to hand out a couple of honorable mentions because there were several events that could easily have made this list. They deserve to make this list, and they show how well-rounded this year was and how important it was. And my third honorable mention is going to go to Nick Bockwinkel winning his final AWA championship. Now, guys, when you think about the American Wrestling Association, obviously you think about Vern Gagne. He is the perennial champion, but Nick Bockwinkel is right up there. I mean, it's similar to like looking at the NWA and saying who's the greatest, who's the perennial guy. Obviously, you got Lou Thesz, but then you got Harley Race, you got Dory Funk Jr., you got Flair. Today, you got Aldis. They're indispensable, and you can't have the NWA the way we conceive it without those names, and you cannot have an AWA without Nick Bockwinkel. Let's put it in perspective. Obviously, Vern Gagne held the championship more than anybody else in that promotion. He held it for 10 days, 4,677 combined days. The number 2 was Nick Bockwinkel, 4 reigns for 2,990 days. The longest reign that was ever held, or that we ever experienced in AWA, was Vern Gagne's historic 2,626 day reign. Let me put my glasses on here, make sure I'm reading my notes correctly here. Sorry, I'm getting old. 2,625 days. And I'm just quibbling here, but the longest reign in AWA history, one of the longest reigns of all time. Second longest reign, Nick Bockwinkel. Nick Bockwinkel ended the longest reign in St. Paul, Minnesota on November the 8th, 1975, defeating Vern Gagne, and he would go on to reign for 1,714 days. So these two are extremely important. And you cannot overstate their role in the success and the legacy of that promotion. And Nick Bockwinkel would have four reigns at the pinnacle, at the mountaintop in the AWA. And his 4th one began in 1986. It would end in 1987. And this is not by any stretch his greatest reign. Again, his greatest reign came in 75 when he dethroned Vern Gagne. But this was Nick Bockwinkel's final send-off. He would reign for the rest of the year, and he was given the championship after Stan Hansen was stripped of the championship, and then he reigned for nearly a year, losing the belt to Kurt Hennig in 1987, and shortly thereafter, Nick Bockwinkel would ride off into the sunset, retire as one of the greats of all time. But honorable mention number 3, the final reign of Nick Bockwinkel. Honorable mention number 2, I've got to say this. We mentioned in the beginning of this episode that we often think of the Midnight Express, Loverboy Dennis and Beautiful Bobby, as one of the great tag teams of all time, and they are. And you would think that they had all these championships, these world titles. So they had the one NWA Tag Team Championship that they won from the Rock and Roll Express. Similarly, when we think of the WWF, we think of the British Bulldogs as being one of the great tag teams. Obviously, the Hart Foundation, the Dudleys, Edge and Christian, and those, and Edge and Christian. I think the Dudleys have more tag teams than any. But then those tag teams like the British Bulldogs and the Hart Foundation, 1 championship, 2 for the Hart Foundation, but they are considered the greats. And I remember just loving the British Bulldogs. They would have that. They were short, stocky guys. They had that snap suplex that was so quick. They were ground fighters. They were high flyers. They could do it all. And they had that legendary feud with the Dream Team of Greg Valentine and Brutus the Barber Beefcake, which would come to a head at WrestleMania number 2. Now, remember, we said earlier that in 1986, WrestleMania 2 came from 3 cities, New York, Chicago, and LA. And in Mid-America, Chicago, they played host to this tag team epic between the Dream Team and the British Bulldogs. And the British Bulldogs came out with their first and only World Tag Team Championship. And that is your honorable mention number 2 in 1986, the British Bulldog winning the WWF World Tag Team Championship at WrestleMania number 2. And my honorable mention number 1, before we get to our final reason, was simply this: Pro Wrestling Illustrated. Now, again, I said it earlier, maybe in the first part of this 2-part series, that for me, growing up, PWI was like a sibling. I hung out with them. I would read them, reread them. They were by my bedside. I did not dare. I cherished them. I still have many of them. Eventually gave some away and all that. And I have a bunch of them hanging on my walls. And 1986 was just the greatest year for PWI. It had the greatest, most iconic covers. Now, not the most iconic cover. The most iconic cover of all time was in 1984, the April edition with Ric Flair holding Sweet Charlotte on the cover. That is the issue for me. But 1986 had some of the most iconic covers. You had the cover with Hulk Hogan. You had the cover with Mike Von Erich. You had the cover with the Road Warriors, the one with Randy Savage, the one with Nikita Koloff, the British Bulldogs, the Rock and Roll Express, Dusty Rhodes with the big gold around his waist. But the greatest cover, one of the most iconic covers ever, was that Achievement 85 issue that came out in March. And this is the one with the Road Warriors, Hogan, and Flair on the cover wearing their red PWI shirts. I wish I was wearing my PWI shirt now. I wore it on the last episode. Holding the plaques. And I remember Flair talking about, coming up to receive his Wrestler of the Year award in blue jeans. And, this is a man who wears suits. He wears business suits, custom-made suits, alligator shoes, custom-made Rolexes. He doesn't walk around in jeans, but he said, I'm going to show up this time wearing jeans so you can all see what a real man looks like. And for me, that magazine is one of the 2 or 3 most iconic covers of all time. Honorable mention number 1, why 86 was the greatest year, was simply because of the publication Pro Wrestling Illustrated and what they were putting out on their cover and inside those glorious pages. And now we get to the number 1 reason why 1986 was the greatest year in the history of pro wrestling. We already alluded to it, that we had that Great American Bash tour where Flair is defending the title successfully. The goal was to defend it 13 times in 30 days, and he made it to match number 11. Now, he had gone through Road Warrior Hawk. He had beaten Dusty. He'd beaten Nikita. He'd beaten Ricky Morton in a steel cage. He'd beaten Robert Gibson. He'd beaten Wahoo McDaniel. On July the 22nd, he took a little detour to Montreal, beat Rick Martel in the midst of this. And then there was that night in Greensboro, North Carolina, the greatest match of all time, 1986 PWI Match of the Year inside the steel cage, the match that defined, that summed up the classic great feud between perennial opponents. I'm talking about Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes in the steel cage. Dusty in those black trunks, Flair coming out in that silver and sequin robe with the purple trunks, the purple boots inside the cage. I was absolutely certain that Flair was going to run the gauntlet successfully, but that was not to be. On this night, July 26th, in Greensboro, North Carolina, Dusty Rhodes dethroned Ric Flair to win his 3rd and final NWA World's Heavyweight Champion in one of the greatest matches, in my opinion, the greatest match ever wrestled by 2 human beings. And there you have it, folks. I'm not just out here making blind assertions. I'm spitting facts. The AWA, World Class, the WWF, and the NWA each collaborated, not necessarily deliberately, but they all collaborated to bring us perhaps the greatest year in the world's greatest sport. I didn't even touch on the UWF, the World Wrestling Council, what was going on in the Pacific Northwest, Stampede. I didn't even touch those. I didn't even mention that 1986 was some of the most important days because they gave us some of the most important birthdays. Guys like Seth Rollins, Serena Deeb, Charlotte Flair, Dalton Castle, Enzo Amore, Nick Aldis, of course, the most important of all being the lovely Tanya Stinson. I didn't bring any of that up, but I didn't have to. Without a doubt, 1986 was the greatest year. Every year before and every year since has been a footnote. Convince me otherwise. This is Dr. Stinson. This is the House Call, and you're in good hands. We'll see you next time.